Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Audrey Lau, and I am the Adult and Senior Services Specialist for the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. This summer, our library system and the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights debuted a Lunch and Learn series. Today's Lunch and Learn series continues this series, and we are thankful that you've chosen to be with us today. With me as co-hosts are Tiana Davis, the Community Development Associate, and Kyla Hennington, the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Chief with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. The PG Office of Human Rights investigates complaints of discrimination, combats human trafficking around the region, ensures all people can access county government services in the language of their preference, and provides learning and engagement opportunities in areas of civil justice import. This afternoon's guest is Ben Egerman, and we're excited to hear about the work he's been doing to recover, preserve, and promote LGBTQ+ history in Maryland. Ben Egerman is a public librarian and researcher living in Baltimore. His work with Preservation Maryland on the Maryland LGBTQ Historic Context Study yielded a preliminary list of over 300 sites related to LGBTQ+ history in the state and an interactive map displaying them, and has been recognized by the American Historical Association's Committee on LGBT+ History, who awarded the project the Allan Berube Prize for Community History in the early 2024. He has worked with a fellow librarian and 2 community elders to bring various stories of Maryland's LGBTQ+ past to audiences in libraries, universities, and community groups across the state. He aims for his work to lie at the intersection of community building, advocacy, and public history. Ben, thank you for joining us today. I know that's a lot. But if there's anything more you need to add.
No, that's very extensive. The only thing, it wasn't explicitly mentioned, I'm a librarian here at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. At our central library in Baltimore. That's actually where I'm coming from or streaming from. So I just wanted to shout that out.
Which room are you in?
The Poe room. You can actually see a little tiny portrait of the guy behind me.
Pratt is a lot of fun. So Ben, you have a presentation for us.
Yeah.
If you could go ahead and I'm really excited about this, by the way.
Yeah. If you want to put up the slides, that would be great. And I just wanted to give a very quick sort of overview of what you just described and the work that I've done and what I'll be talking about. As all mentioned, the one thing to point out here, there is a link at the bottom, I'm sure they will share it, that has sort of like links to all of the resources I'm about to talk about. So you can sort of look into them and decide more. When I, a few years ago, I guess 5 years ago, I was working for a historic preservation group called Preservation Maryland on creating, what's called the Maryland LGBTQ Historic Context Study. And that's like a sort of overview. It's designed for primarily people in like historic preservation type spaces, but has, sort of a broader, list of themes and ideas. And it has that, at the end is that list that I created with about 300 to 400 sites on it. Actually, I think it's a little less because it's only the places that have still standing buildings. So it's between 200 and 300. And then on the right is the thing, planting the rainbow flag. That's a more public facing sort of simplified version of it that gets into some of that same history. The other thing I worked on is this thing called a history pin map. And this was taking all those sites that I had found and putting them into this site where it can be a interactive map. You can go through, you can look specifically on, I want to know if there are sites around where I live. You can also search by tags, you can maybe see it on top, but if you're interested in primarily like trans people and trans history, you can click that. If you're interested in history of LGBTQ people of color, you can click that. And you can sort of play around with this a lot. Now, what I will say is it's a lot of sites, but this wasn't like super in-depth research. It's sort of what's called a survey, which means it's basically guideposts for people to do further research. And so again, I always tell people to sort of play around with it, see what you find. Quick things on doing it. A lot of the work that I did was searching through newspaper databases and old historic newspapers to sort of find these stories. And this is really difficult because it's something that was famously a huge taboo, and something that was not spoken about in sort of respectable publications. Meanwhile, you know, the terms that we use for them, I mean, even a term like homosexual was created in the late 1800s, but you're not going to find it in a newspaper before really the 1930s or so. So really when we're going as far back as we can, and the stuff I found really goes back to about the 1830s. You have to look around for a bunch of different terms, different sort of ways of trying to talk around the fact that people were LGBTQ. And the easiest way to do that is to look for what we call gender transgression. So people who are dressed in the wrong outfit, right? So someone dressed in female attire or believes herself a man. These are ways that people talked about it that could sort of give you a hint that, oh, this is like someone we might recognize. And I put on the right side a clip from one of these articles from 1879. I can show you, this is actually the first indication of any like group of LGBTQ people gathering. Like there are individuals beforehand, but this is the first time you see something that people are basically dressing up for a party, and it's effectively Black drag queens going to a party. You wouldn't have found it unless you were looking, again, dressed in female attire and things like that. So that's a really important thing. And then the other thing is, there's an obvious issue with this, which is one of source bias, which is to say, if you're looking at newspapers and newspapers only really talked about someone who we'd see as LGBTQ if they were arrested, that generally means you might walk away with the sense that like all LGBTQ people are criminals. Most of us aren't that interesting, but that's sort of like a thing you have to control for, I guess. So what do we find in this? We found a lot of really interesting early stories. These are things from, I would say, before 1900. And I just want to highlight a few. So on the left there is a guy named Howard Calder. And he, in around 1890, made a big media sensation when he tried to elope with the girl next door to Baltimore after announcing in the press that his term was, I was born and lived for 25 years a woman, and then the last 10 years I have been becoming a man, right? So really sort of very explicitly stating, I am trans. And it was a big media sensation. There's a whole complex story there, but it sort of shows a way of talking about it and way of thinking that people had that was actually, you know, despite the fact that it was 130 years ago, is fairly modern. And then on the right is this huge, this murder trial that happens in the Eastern Shore in 1879, where it's two women who are almost completely openly dating in this small town, and then things go south. One of them shoots the other. But it becomes this huge thing where everyone's trying to figure out, well, what do we call this person who is this woman who acts like a man and you know, wears very butch clothing, is really sporty, and like all these sort of stereotypes that we still live with. But again, you sort of see that, like, despite the fact that it's well over a century ago, there's something very common, very modern to it. Now, there are some other themes that come out. I think the one is that Maryland has been a sort of like, has this very strong history of like Black LGBTQ leadership. And the most obvious version of this is the first ever Black LGBT organization, the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays, which was started in Columbia, Maryland, when one activist, Billy Jones, who's the guy on the far right there, who lived there, brought in Black queer activists from Baltimore and DC together to first organize what was called the Third World Lesbian and Gay Conference. It's the first ever conference for LGBT people of color, and then eventually to form an organization that became the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays. In general, the movement in Baltimore had a very strong set of leadership that was much more diverse than you would find in a lot of gay activist groups at the time. And this is sort of like a through line throughout Maryland's LGBTQ history. The other thing that comes up a lot is, and this is actually really important if we're talking about PG County, is the Maryland's history being shaped a lot by our proximity to DC and to the federal government. And so this meant in the 50s and 60s, when there was a lot of repression against gays and lesbians in federal employment, it really affected Maryland very, very much. But it also meant that later on, when there were protests, that they often happened in Maryland, in Montgomery County or Prince George's County. And so, for example, in the late 80s, early 90s, the AIDS activist group ACT UP held two of its sort of largest protests, one in front of the National Institutes of Health, the other one at the FDA. And these were both in Maryland. They had hundreds of people coming from across the country to protest and, and have these events in Maryland. So this is a huge part of this story of effectively the LGBTQ history in the state. And then I think that's actually, you know what, that's it. That is the presentation. I just want, I could talk a lot about this. I do a hour-long presentation on this subject, which I've given to Prince George's County Libraries several times. And I just wanted to give a really quick sort of overview of what kind of things we're talking about here. So yeah, that's the presentation.
Well, I'm going to ask the historian question of how did you start? Like, where did this come from in your brain? Like, you woke up one day, or did something hit you and say, I want to know more about this. Can I find more about this? Because to me, this is like this is a lifetime passion project, like, to me, because it seems like you're literally recovering from the historical documents individuals who lived very real lives, and this is not a very modern, we're talking about the 19th century and before, and so you're having to recover these people from essentially what were considered transgressions. So how did you start this? Where did this come from?
Yeah, this actually started quite a while ago. When I was in undergrad, I have a degree in a bachelor's in history, and I was asked to write a senior thesis, and I did. I found a old, it's called Gay and Lesbian American History. And it's just a book of various sources. And I saw that there was these writings from the 1840s in New York that are sort of the first writings on a gay subculture in New York. And that fascinated me. That absolutely fascinated me because, among other things, I think this is changing. I grew up at a time when if you were gay, you learned that your history did not go beyond 1969 when there was the Stonewall Uprising. That before then, everyone was really quiet and sad, and there wasn't much of a historical record of them. And so to see this was mind-blowing. And so I'd always loved that. I didn't wind up doing much with it until many years later when I was in my Master's of Library Science program at College Park. And saw this ad and I was just like, I remember emailing them and saying like, hi, I might actually be like the perfect person for this and I really want to do it. And sure enough, I think I was right. And yeah, that's the story.
So I guess my question, my follow-up question was, working at the Pratt, where you are, how does that help you with your research?
Well, we have a huge amount of resources. One of the ones that there are two that I use really extensively. One is our periodicals room. The Pratt Central Library, where I work, actually I think directly downstairs from where I am, has the largest collection of Maryland newspapers in existence. And so being able to say, here's this story that was written about in Baltimore and New York about this, these two women where there was this murder case. Well, I wonder what the local newspaper, right, the small town newspaper was saying about it and get their perspective on it. And it's very different, right? So I use that a lot. And then the other one is our Maryland department, which just holds a whole bunch of resources on Maryland history. And that's been where a lot of things have come from. We have everything. Oh God, we have this amazing document from the 19 teens where the state commissioned a bunch of public health officials to write a report on vices in Baltimore, most of which is about what was sort of seen as the red light district. But there's a whole 3-4 page appendix of, we found these strange men who all seem to talk with their hands and have a mincing walk and be really over the top and call each other women's names. And this is how you can find out where they hang out, which is actually an incredible historical sort of document. We also have the only copy because the report itself was presented to the governor and rejected because it was too embarrassing. So we have all these resources, and I always love to tell people this because also a big part of my job is to help people with these resources. And that's also been a big part of this, is people will get curious about some of this stuff and want to look into it more. And that's sort of a way for me to also find those, sources and find the history.
So I had the opportunity to see one of your longer presentations, I think the hour-long one. And so how prisons handle trans individuals didn't make it into your sort of shortened one. Can you talk about that here?
Sure. There's a really weird common story. Prison officials really, especially the further back you go, didn't know what to make of trans people as a general rule. And so oftentimes what would wind up happening is you have, for example, the one in the 1830s is this trans man named George Wilson. And he's like a sailor and gets arrested trying to sell a stolen horse. In the jail, they don't know what to do because he won't wear women's clothes, won't do what he sees as women's work, swears like a sailor, seems like really sort of brusque for like a women's prison at the time. And so eventually they asked the governor to pardon him on the condition that he just go back to England where he's from and not come back to Maryland. And that was actually really common because they just didn't know what to do. And so oftentimes they would basically say just get out of our hair. And so that's a really interesting sort of thing that you can see happening a bit.
We have some comments that I'm going to share because I think we can talk about them, and I'm hoping that you can just kind of expand a little bit on these comments. So there's a 2-part comment from one of our regular viewers who's a wonderful educator in our county and a good friend to the Office of Human Rights and to the library system, Denise Stewart, who says, this is a very important topic. I wish we did more in our school communities to educate the staff and students on acceptance for all communities. And there's a part 2 to this comment, which is, as a public educator, special educator, Denise teaches inclusion amongst all populations and is very passionate about inclusion and acceptance. And so I realize there's not a specific question there, but I'd really like to hear from you, your thoughts on this, and this being the teaching of inclusivity and acceptance and history and full history in our school systems.
Well, first I'd say in general, I actually talk a lot about this, that there's something really great about doing sort of, well, yeah, what I would call like histories of inclusion or more diverse histories when we're really talking about local history. Because oftentimes when we talk about local history, effectively it means who was an extremely wealthy man who lived in this town, right? Or who built a thing. And it's not often these stories that, you know, are of diverse populations. Or there was this great story in North Beach, Maryland, which is like over in Calvert County, and where in those 50s and 60s, where there was all this repression in DC, there was a gay bar that cropped up and became this sort of like haven. And it's this amazing history that you don't think of as like a small town in Calvert County becoming this haven for LGBT people at a time when they had to escape the homophobia of Washington, DC, right? Which does not seem like a narrative that makes much sense anymore. But again, it's one of these things where it's like, that is a local history that should get told, because you should be able to sort of take that local pride in those histories of inclusion. And in terms of education, I know that there's teachers around who have talked about ways to bring LGBTQ education to it. I've also often spoke to like sort of like LGBT student groups. And that's another great place. Groups like PFLAG often will host sort of events that are really designed for the students to go and have a place to learn about things. And so that's absolutely, I think it's really important. And it's really important for it to be included in, you know, what we consider sort of a standard school history.
You know, I really appreciate it because, you know, I also like you and Audrey, sorry, Tiana, I also have an undergraduate degree in history. And one of the things that was so great for me, just as a human in the world, going and doing my undergraduate degree, which I didn't do till I was 35, so I'd had a minute to live out here in the universe, was looking at social histories and microhistories, because up until that stage of my life, I understood the history, you know, again, history was rich white men, typically people who had been elected into power and maybe led an army. And that was what history looked like. And so the way that history and that understanding is leaves most of us out of the record and most of us invisible. And so to realize that the study of history is in fact not that. History is not that, actually. I mean, that's a part of it. It's not saying it's not an important part, but there's so much else there. And I love what you're doing in bringing this, you know, micro social history out. And so people are seeing the presence of LGBTQ people throughout Maryland, sort of throughout time. And again, the haven that you've just talked about in Calvert County, like I just think it's a critical thing to do. And I'm so glad people are getting to see it. We have another question from a viewer, which I'm going to pose to you. And then I'm going to mute myself so Tiana or Audrey can jump in. So the question from the viewer is from, just I got to get it up here, from Elizabeth or Lizzie Graham, who says, what do you know, if anything, about the history of LGBTQ folks with disabilities or developmental disabilities?
Oh, interesting. So, I mean, I'm sure that there's things in there. I think that part of the issue is, especially when you focus on the older stuff, it's the way people talk about disability has changed a lot, and oftentimes it's not really mentioned. And so it's hard to see. Now, what I will say is that there is a entire sort of, story of specifically how the LGBT community in the late 80s and early 90s focused really extensively on medicine and the availability of medicine because of the AIDS crisis, but it sort of grew well beyond that and was talking about how LGBT people are treated by doctors. And that's a story too that's talking about more than just, people who are suffering from a certain virus, but includes sort of people who are seen as, effectively really seen as disgusting by medical professionals, and how to navigate that. So I think that the answer is that that's where you're generally good. There's also going to be some overlap there. So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
I was just curious, as you've done a lot of work, you have all these sites. What do you hope comes from this project? Like the type of, are we going to see a book? Are we going to see walking tours? Are we going to see plaques? What is your vision for, this kind of recovery? Because I think it's really important that people understand that part of history is, it is a lot of plaques and statues and things like that. It's about marking social spaces. And I think that's really important as we see people as people. So what do you hope to get from this project, all the work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, yes, I am very, very slowly writing a book. But I mean, the answer is yes to all of it. And in some ways it's been successful. I think the biggest success I will say is that when I started doing this, I was one of 3 people in Baltimore doing LGBT history of Maryland that people were not generally doing this. And since this project has completed and these documents are out, it's sort of I have watched as people get more interested, start doing more work on it. And it's really something that I'm seeing a lot more of. And so that's, to me, the most exciting part of it, because I can only do so much, but if I'm helping to inspire other people to look into it, that's what's exciting. And then also, the plaque stuff I think is really important. This was for a historic preservation group. So one of the outcomes was identifying sites that we want to try and get on the National Register, because, and specifically for their LGBTQ history. And so there were sites throughout the state who we've recommended. I do know that there were, I think, 2 in Baltimore and 3 in Montgomery County that actually did get applied. I don't know what the status is. But I mean, that's the answer is I want people to be excited about this and interested in this and feel like this is their history and they want to know more.
Yeah, I really love how you've a lot of your presentation that I've seen, and a lot of the work that you've done is really about teaching people how to go through sources and uncover, because it is hard. You're trying to recover language that we don't use today to talk about. I mean, it changes over time, but also just being willing to seek it out, to say, I know this, I know you're out there, and I love that. The concept of recovery to me is so important, because it's whole groups of people that you're saying they were here, they lived in these communities just like you did, and really struggled. I mean, that was the thing that a lot of what you talk about is a lot of what Laurel Thatcher Ulrich talked about when she talked about her well-behaved women comment how they rarely make history. And you're looking at these transgressions, gender transgressions, women who talk back in public, who, and like talk a little bit about what the reality of this, like these transgressions were at this time, because I don't know that a lot of people really understand the kind of why there was the secrecy, why there needed to be safe spaces. Could you talk a little bit about that for people at home who may not understand?
Sure. I mean, I think the answer is there's no one answer, right? I think that there are lots of stories of really, of cruelty, right? So you'll see in the 1930s, for example, there's a drag ball that gets broken up by the police in Washington, D.C. And the Baltimore Afro-American publishes an entire thing mocking the drag queens being sort of chased out of the building and, calling them freaks and all this horrible stuff. Now, that said, that's an important story because the Afro actually covered a lot of these balls that were happening all the time. There are pictures of them from the 1930s, and they were happening multiple times per year in Baltimore. They never actually got rated there. And when you look at the pictures, you don't see people who are downtrodden and, just sort of whose story ends at dealing with repression. You see people who are fabulous and having a lot of fun and like posing and really like celebrating in a community space. And so there's always going to be a little bit of both, and sort of trying to figure out, the reactions and everything. You find sort of parts that are, again, about, unfortunately, that real sort of repressive, often cruel sort of edge of it. But you also will find these stories of people who are living their lives fairly openly, and finding ways to sort of do that, and to do that in a way that lets their life continue, right? That lets them live the life they want to live.
So do you work with other people, say in Virginia or Delaware, who maybe want to do this research for their own state to try to find that history?
Not Virginia. Delaware, I have this great connection with this woman, Carol Ann Deal, who actually got, it's on, I think it's the state like historic preservation website, has now a whole section on LGBT history in Delaware. And we've talked a lot, and it was actually really fun because we did a talk in Ocean City, and I'm thinking, okay, LGBT history around Ocean City. Okay, I will ask about Rehoboth. And what was fun about it was I had heard sort of rumors from one of the elders who we work with of like the sort of story of how the gay beach in Rehoboth became the gay beach, right? Which was some wealthy DuPont family heir, made it that way. That was basically it. And as it turns out, that is in fact the exact story that was effectively told as an oral history or as an oral tradition, because this was something that happened in the 1930s. It was an heiress who was sort of like in with a lot of the gay, lesbian, bi folks in Hollywood and on Broadway, and would bring them in, and then they would have these parties out on the beach, and that sort of stuck. And so seeing those, but also unsurprisingly, that woman had a lot of history in Maryland as well, because like if you're, in Delaware, there's a good chance you're, not just, people's lives don't just end at a state line, right? And so, yeah, I love it because it tells sort of the ways that the stories are the same and the ways the stories are different between these places that are very close, but, they're different states. And I just also, I find it really fun to watch like other people do the same kind of work that I really enjoy doing.
All right, I want to back up just a little bit to the book, because we are all pre-ordering it and we're booking you to come and talk about the book, because I was so interested in, well, first of all, interested anyway, but I do want to kind of highlight this document, the Planting the Rainbow Flag document, that as I read it, and so for those watching at home, it is in the link tree. We've been sharing the link tree in the comments. We also have a direct link. If you go up, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, we did put a direct link to that PDF earlier in the program, so you can click on that, or again, get it from the link tree. But one of the things that I loved about this, and I'm hoping that you'll take a moment to just kind of expand, is the stories. Like, again, and this is maybe my kind of microhistory interest, but you mentioned, so I'm going to throw some names out, and if you want to grab one and talk in more detail for viewers who haven't had a chance to read that document yet, you have the story of Margaret Brent, that I thought was just so interesting to see this person brought to life, or Benjamin Banneker. And so there's others, but would you like to take a moment and talk to the viewers about one of these people that you've highlighted in this planting the rainbow flag?
Well, now I have to think.
Okay.
Those two are ones that I haven't talked about in a long time, and I don't remember a lot of.
Not to set you up. Sorry.
But what I will say, this is one, unfortunately, that it's like totally not an answer to your question, because this is a story that I discovered shortly after the report was published. But it is that lesbian murder I talked about that took place in this town, Pocomoke City, and on the Eastern Shore. And what I love about it is it's that microhistory, it's that social history, because you have this one story. It's about these two young women, I think one was 19, one was 20, who, like, everyone seems to know were just like incredibly close and intimate in a way that was off. And from that story, which becomes this national thing, right? This huge national thing, that image is from a tabloid in New York. And what it becomes is this thing of how are different newspaper editors and writers making sense of this? And what it becomes is how effectively were people that we would see as lesbians today viewed in these different places? Because what you find is actually closer to the place, and in more rural areas, it's not seen as something very serious, right? But it's seen as, oh, there are strange people all over, whatever. Like, she seems to have been one of these crazy, strange people. And then as you get to bigger cities, the story starts changing, where there's one, my favorite is there's one in a smaller city. It's actually in Hartford, Connecticut, where the newspaper says, explains who she is, and then says, this woman seems to be, or Miss Dorr seems to be of a type of woman which thankfully we don't have here. But then once you get to Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York, it's people recognize, because this is where there are already starting to be lesbian communities. And in New York specifically, writers are saying things like, there are women who love women in every community. There are thousands here in New York, right? And what it becomes is this small event, this sort of tragedy that happens in a rural area becomes a way to look at how, like, LGBTQ people, and specifically how queer women were viewed effectively across the Northeast. And it becomes this incredible way of sort of seeing those social attitudes. And what's amazing too is in that story, afterwards, the woman who all of that is written about winds up just sort of like living a very normal life. And there's an article a few years later where people say, oh, they just seem to see this as an unfortunate moment in her life. And she's still very strange, but respected by everyone because she's smart and helps out effectively. And that's effectively what mattered in a small town. And so those stories, and seeing how those stories can bring you to these different places specifically, right? How a story, that's the story of how this murder trial in the Eastern Shore became this whole thing in the Northeast. But the one I mentioned before about the gay bar in North Beach, that's a story about what's happening in DC and happening in Baltimore, because you can't talk about it without talking about why people needed to leave, right? And you start learning about, oh, this is what it actually meant. This is like, gay bars in DC would be raided, and they would literally just go through and try and figure out who was in the military, who was in the federal government, who could they get fired, right? And so like these stories that start, especially the ones that start in sort of smaller towns and places in Maryland, wind up having this sort of broader, social view of that context, what's going on.
I really appreciate this too, because I think it can kind of turn on its head some of our assumptions and our biases. I think present day, I'm not going to say what those biases were historically, but I think sometimes people who live in an urban setting, in contemporary settings, may have certain thoughts about what it's like to be in a small town that are not necessarily accurate, but like a belief system about that. And so I think to have this, what you're describing is, it does kind of turn on its head some of those assumptions that we may have. And I think hopefully allows us in present day, like those viewers and us who are interviewing you now, to just have a little bit more curiosity about what's going on in other spaces in Maryland.
Yeah, absolutely.
We do have another question from the audience that I want to share. And then again, I'll hand it back to Audrey and Tiana. So Denise Stewart is wondering, with passing being an important issue with the LGBTQ plus community, is there a relation to racial passing that occurred during slavery and the civil rights era?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I don't think in the sort of literal sense. I'm sure that there is, but it's not really well attested. You're when you're looking at these things where it's like, you'll find a case every few years of someone, where they'll say is like discovered to be a woman or discovered to be a man. I can't recall anywhere it's sort of the literal like, and discovered to be a different race, right? Even though there are examples of this that are pre-Civil War, right? But again, I think that in general, sort of that interplay between, how do you assert yourself or not as an LGBTQ person or as a person of color, as a Black person, as whatever, those stories are really big, right? And the two ones that I already sort of mentioned are the places where that becomes the clearest. One is those drag balls in the 30s, because you actually see how they were covered really extensively in the Afro, right? So in the Black newspaper. And so there's a lot of commentary on, sort of how they view sexuality and race. There's also articles, there's an article by one of the drag queens and that's talking about his view on sexuality. And then the other one is the NCBLG, National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays, where their motto was as proud of our gayness as we are of our Blackness, right? And they made it really explicit that this was about connecting, sort of, well, effectively about saying that they needed to be able to be proud of being who they were without whitewashing it, right? That they needed to assert their place, not just within the gay community, also within the Black community, and sort of like putting that together. You look up that group, they're amazing. But yeah.
I just kind of wanted to touch on real briefly. A lot of the history that I am interested in is about historical memory and the way we pass things down. Can you talk a little bit about the fact that this is not history that is often passed down? Just a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think you might have seen my last Lunch and Learn where I talked about this.
I love that.
This is actually a really fascinating thing to me, and it really drives me in doing this. So like the way I always put it is like, I'm Jewish. So if I want to know about Jewish history, my frame of reference is generally going to be people like my grandparents and their parents and so on, right? It's family history that's been passed down. And so that's how I learn about the experience of being Jewish in America, of being Jewish in the Russian Empire, you know, anti-Semitism, of whatever. That doesn't work for LGBTQ people, right? Like, we don't get that same sort of opportunity. And so it's really, really, I would say the default is that you're really alienated from your history, right? And so you don't know any of this stuff. And you have to look for it. And that's why I'm so sort of adamant about like this public history aspect of it, of not just, you know, producing this report, doing the research, but really making sure to go around and educate people, and especially sort of reach out whenever I do these talks. I try to reach out to local LGBT groups, because people in the community, we don't know our history. And it can be really fascinating when you read something like that 19 teens document, right? And look at it and be like, some of these are the ways that me and my friends talk. Right. And you can look at, in the 1940s, there's a thing in New York that's published that opens with, it's called the like English to Gayese dictionary. And like, it's almost all modern. It's all the same slang, right? And all these things that we think of as, because I think every single generation of queer people thinks of themselves as like the first, right? Like, you know, like we're the first in this like sort of historical context or situation. So everything we're doing is new. It's not true. And so being able to sort of look into that, it can change a lot of, again, this historical memory, which is how we build up our own identity and how we think of ourselves and think of our relationship to the past. So yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, I always kind of grew up with stories about great aunts and uncles, and you know, you kind of ask and the question kind of stops. And I've always wondered about their lives, you know, because they lived in that like really, you know, 1920s, 1930s, and you know, I have a great grandmother who just was a flapper. But, you know, I mean, that culture is, and, you know, it's like, I wish I had known at age 8 to ask when she said that, you know, I didn't need men. Like, what does that mean? You know, and what did that mean to her? And what kind of, you know, that world that she, you know, she went to clubs, she went, we're talking Southern Indiana, you know, really not your typical, you know, big city. And, you know, I just feel you know, memory is so much about not just what we remember, but what we forget. And I love that your research in particular has really dug in and recovered and allowed people to have a history. And I think that's so great. It's so reaffirming to people in the present. It gives them a pass, but it also talks about like, you know, there's been this resiliency and creativity that is over the generations that really needs to be celebrated, if I can say that, and really appreciated for the spaces that it creates. I mean, it's just like a whole world that you just have like magically made happen, and it's just really cool.
I don't know that I magically made anything.
Well, not magically, but I mean, it really it just kind of comes out.
I appreciate that a lot.
It's like it looks like a building, and look what it actually is. I mean, it's not, you know, you're looking at these buildings in Prince George's County, you're like, how is that a place that people want to be? And I mean, if you're not part of the club, and if you're not in the know, it might as well be another building.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, Audrey. I was actually clicking through the History Pin website that was on the link tree, and it's just so interesting, especially sort of like we all know, gay people didn't just appear, right? But like to see evidence that, you know, they were here before the 80s. It's really fun and interesting. I do want to make sure we get to this other question that was in the chat. Lizzie Graham said, what do you know about the history of AAPI LGBTQ people?
Yeah, Asian American Pacific Islander LGBTQ people. I'm trying to think. I can't think of anything locally. There's a lot of great history, and part of this, and I'm saying this like nationally, and also based in fact that one of the the sort of like place that became the nation's first big gay city, which is San Francisco, also is a place with a huge Asian American population, and so there's a lot of really good writing about it and a lot of good history about it. I am not sure that I can think off the top of my head of anything in Maryland. I'm sure that there is, and I'm sure that there are people that I can point to. I just not off the top of my head.
Kyla, did you have any other questions?
Well, I'm laughing because I'm the chatter of the group, but I'm trying really hard to stay more muted this time. One of the things like that I was thinking as I looked at this and I looked at your work and knew that you were coming, I was excited you were coming, and I want to talk about, and I think you touched on this in your presentation, but I want to go into a little bit more detail about like what a mammoth project this is. And I think you've touched on it, but I want to bring this out. Like if you're looking at newspapers, one of the things you're looking at, and you looked at this, like this bias in newspaper, what is causing the newspaper to be interested in telling this particular person's story? And so again, there's going to be a reason that somebody attracted the attention of the newspaper or more likely the law. And so it could be, gender deviance, but there's all of these people who LGBTQ folks who wouldn't have gotten the law's attention or the newspaper's attention. So I want to can you just go into more information about just like the project, how you looked at the research? You talked about coming up with different terms. And is there a way to, outside of newspapers, to get these stories and the history, like kind of the invisible history?
Sure. So with the newspapers, largely it's sort of observing from what I already knew. Again, doing many years ago, this stuff about the old articles from the 1840s was like a good jumping off point of like seeing what I knew existed and then trying to say, oh, okay, so this said, wearing women's clothing. So I'll look for that.
Right.
And stuff like that. Other sources are hard to find. There is one of my favorite quotes is from a historian named Graham Robb, who wrote, at any point in the 19th century, someone somewhere was burning the letters of a homosexual relative, which is true. But but there are sort of these little places where that doesn't happen. There's this amazing story, again, in the Eastern Shore, this woman, Rebecca Primus, is a Black woman running a freeman's school in 1865, who wrote these letters back and forth to her lover back in Connecticut, where she was from, and saved them. And somehow in the 1990s, someone realized that when the family had donated everything, that this had been preserved. And so it's this amazing story. You get to read all of this, but it's tough because it's like you don't know what's not there, right?
Well, I one of the things we like to do is, again, so Tiana and I represent the Office of Human Rights along with our wonderful friend Audrey, who's representing the library. And one of the things that we look at when we do these programs, we're talking about bringing people together or building understanding, we like to give people a takeaway. And so that's kind of, I realize we're getting close to time here. And so I'm wondering if you can think about like, what's a takeaway for our viewers? I mean, beyond, I'm going to give a takeaway, which is to go on that link tree that we keep sharing, and watch some of the videos and read this really incredible booklet that we really recommend. But for you, Ben, what's something that you feel like, hey, for all of you out there listening, tuning in, whether you're tuning in now, watching on demand later, what's a takeaway about this history and this understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the first one is history isn't as straight and narrow as you think, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the big one. But the other one is something I said a little earlier, which is just because, especially prior to the 70s, that there was a lot of repression, it was very difficult, doesn't mean that people didn't find ways to live their life on their own terms and didn't find ways to build a community. And you can really see that when you look back and see it, even though, in the 1930s, for a Black drag queen to write an article saying like, yeah, I'm gay. That's someone who's dealing with just this incredible amount of repression from society, who is still finding ways to live on his own terms. And so that's the big thing, is that, even in those really, really dark times, people were sort of finding that and finding out how to do that.
I guess I have to be the bad guy now. This is Kyla's always has to be the bad guy and tell people we have to go. But I just want to thank our guest, Ben Egerman, today, who has come to visit us and share his knowledge and his discoveries and just his passion for this project, which I think is really fantastic. And if you have a chance, really, there's so much there for you to discover. I want to thank my co-hosts, Tiana Davis and Kyla Hannington, for joining us. And I thank all of you out there for your time. The best way to support our guests today is to check out the information on Ben's Linktree, which we'll put in the chat, and we've been putting in the chat. Join us next Tuesday at noon for Margaret McMullen on her book, Where the Angels Lived, where she discovers the existence of a long-lost relative at Israel's Holocaust Museum and begins an unexpected journey of revelation and connectivity as she tirelessly researches the history of her ancestors. If you want to know more about the work done by the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, you can visit them at civilrights, all one word, .mypgc.us. If you'd like to know more about this series or other programs at PGCMLS, you can visit our website at www.pgcmls.info/events. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, Ben. You've been great guest, and we're looking for that book. We need to know. We need to be on that release. We want to talk about your book. So, and any of that, if you want to come back and tell us more about what you're finding, we're here for it, because this is just great.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.